Hey guys, we're going to do chapter 6 for Theories of Criminology. I was going to combine 6 and 11 into one voiceover, but I decided not to do that because I want to keep them separate so that you can go back and review chapter 11 as we're talking about more of the theories, and look at that information and use those theories that we get to like next week. So anyway, here is chapter 6, which is the individual theories of crime, a biosocial perspective. We are moving into the positivist paradigm. And positivism is completely opposite than the classical school and deterrence, and dominated American criminology for the most of the 20th century. I'm talking about the classical school. But the positivism criminology includes biological, psychological, and sociological. And the goal with this paradigm is to help and not punish. I have a diagram that I'm working on, and I'll show you part of it here, and then I'll bring the rest of it to class. Within this paradigm, we're really talking about nature versus nurture, nature, biology, genetics, mental. Nurture is more of the environment, the early childhood. These theories share two common elements, and we're going to talk more about determinism throughout deterministic positivism. Lombroso, he is known as the father of positivistic criminology. He defined criminal anthropology, which is the study of organic and psychic constitution of abnormal, which he considered criminal persons. He focused on the study of phrenology, which is measuring the human skull, which therefore dictates the risk of criminal and deviant behavior. He also brought us Addictive, which is more of a primitive thought pattern related back to Darwin. And he maintained that humans demonstrate different levels of biological development, and believed that atavistic criminals were considered born criminals. So in the beginning, he classified all criminals as atavistic. But as time went on, he later revised his theory to really say that a third of criminals were atavistic and 2/3 were criminaloids. He devised a sample list of characteristics of atavists. And before I jump into this, I just want to make sure and explain what we're talking about when we are talking about atavism. That your body type dictates what type of criminal you are, or it's goes back to a very primitive thought pattern. So we're looking at this as you're born with the risk, and the way you look and the way you are will dictate what kind of person you become. So this is why this is completely opposite of free will. It has nothing to do with that. You are either born with the gene to kill and commit crime, or you're not. So his list of characteristics that he included was the larger or smaller skull than the average skull. So he's got the average, and then there's different. Excessively large jaws and cheekbones, shifty eyes or hard expression in your eyes, the flat nose on thieves and the pointy nose on murderers. Rapists and murderers are likely to have fleshy, swollen, and protruding lips, and swindlers have thin, straight lips. And there's another theorist that adds in with this years later about the larger forehead, which really kind of falls under the smaller skull. And what's interesting is my son, he has a protruding forehead that we didn't notice really until he got much older. And he's one of the sweetest, most gentlest people you ever meet. we have Lombroso's successors, and these are those theorists that either built or changed the original idea of positivism. William Ferrero, he worked with Lombroso on The Female Offender. Enrico Ferri, he led positivism to a multifaceted approach in explaining the single criminal. This really led to what his research led to a downfall in Lombroso's. We have Garofalo. He did the lack of pity and probity. I don't know what it is with my speech. Anyway, Goring. Now, Goring was really the first one that undermined Lombroso's work for a lack of scientific explanation. He did not support Lombroso, but he still saw that there were different characteristics in offenders. He looked at the criminal characteristics and would say, for instance, that a murderer is much stronger than somebody that commits a property offense. The next one we have is William Sheldon, and he wrote Constitutional Psychology, and it was a biological approach that built upon the three distinctive body types: the endomorph, the mesomorph, and the ectomorph. And here is the beginning of the diagram that I've started, and as just a review of what I have just gone over, the biological positivism, which I've got as a BP for the rest, started with Lombroso, who really challenged free will. Addictivism, we come down to those that were his successors: Ferri, Garofalo, Goring, and Sheldon. This then led to the bad seed theory, the heredity-based theory, and eugenics, which I'm going to cover next. And as I said, Sheldon, he brought us those three different body types, and he brought us, he really did a lot of research and data on these different body shapes. But from his theory led to the bad seed theory, which is this is also called the heredity-based, also called the selfish gene, that there were forces beyond the control of the person. They were seeking causal explanations. It was biological, psychological, and social structures. This led to eugenics, which was introduced through a study of families throughout generations to identify the criminal propensity. There was a major failure in this type of thinking, was that physical differences in individuals may be products of something other than deviance. This field thought that linking genetic traits to criminal behavior and rested on the premise that nature played a more important role than nurture. So it's looking at not nurture over nature, or when we talked about it at the beginning, nature versus nurture. This is where we're seeing this now, because they were looking at it that it's the same concept as biological positivism. Nature is more important than nurture. Biology is more important than environment. Ernest Houghton, he was a theorist in this era, and he gave little thought to environmental influences. He rested all of his research on the nature side of it. There was the classic study of the Callek family, and they were considered to be a degenerate family. Henry Goddard, he traced their lineage because the husband father was an upstanding man in society, came from a well-known background, but he married what they considered a feeble-minded wife. And so he did the lineage of him and her and traced it back and found that from their 480 descendants, there were 36 that were illegitimate, 33 were prostitutes, 24 were alcoholics, 8 kept brothels, and 3 were criminals. This eventually led to the case of Buck versus Bell in 1927, that the court ruled that the state of Virginia had the authority to administer involuntary surgical sterilization on feeble-minded and other unfit persons that they deemed unfit, if the superintendent of the state institution deemed it in the best interest of the society. What a scary prospect. I'm going back to this diagram because I neglected to show you this, and I wish I could go back in the recording and fix it, and I hope I don't confuse you. I will do it in class again, but this is just to kind of give you a jump start. This is the diagram that I just showed you, where we were talking about biological positivism. So all those things that we just went over, Lombroso all the way down to eugenics and the bad seed theory. This is a more general diagram. So this one, we start off with positivism, which is the paradigm we're talking about in all of these theories, which is the opposite of the classical school. Oops, misspelled. And from positivism, we have biological positivism and contemporary biological perspectives. We talked about biological positivism, jumping down, which is this diagram right here. So this is a part of positivism, the school of positivism. Now we're going to move to talking about contemporary biological perspectives. This is the section on contemporary biological perspectives that was built on the grounds of positivism, where Lombroso started, and now we move to a different section of positivism that includes, we're not looking at nature versus nurture anymore. We're looking at nature and nurture working together, which we're going to move into talking more about the biosocial model. And there's a lot of little bitty areas within this. I'm going to go over them very briefly because I want you to concentrate more on the school of positivism, biological outcomes, biological reasons for behavior, and then the biosocial reasons for behavior. So contemporary is, as I said, looking at nature and nurture. It attributes criminal behavior to a combination of biological, psychological, and sociological risk factors. The individuals are no longer just biologically destined to become criminals. They're not a born criminal. Their behavior is a product of many factors. And there's 4 combinations to include biological, psychological, and sociological risk factors that then produces that antisocial behavior and criminal behavior. From this, we have the addictive biosocial model. Again, these are models. I'm going to go over them quickly. I don't want you to spend a lot of time on reading this. They're important within your book, but I don't want you to have to know. You do not have to know the differences among all these models. Okay. So the addictive biosocial model, or individuals would be more likely to engage in antisocial behavior when they have both biological and sociological risk factors. And it's a combination effect from both nurture and nature. The risk associated with the biological and sociological factors add up in a linear, cumulative fashion. Oh, what happened? Pause my thing here. Let's see what happened. Sorry, guys, I must have hit my mouse. What this all means in a nutshell, if you look down here at the chart, it means that when you're looking at the causes of deviant or criminological behavior, when we look at both of them, when we look at biological and sociological, that we can find a lot more of those factors in someone that has committed a crime. than if you just look at the biological or just look at the sociological. Okay. This moves us to the next model, which is called the Correlated Biosocial model. It includes the passive gene, which is the environmental correlation that occurs when parents transmit a genetic propensity for antisocial behavior to their children via the family environment and genetic transmission. So we're looking at both sources. So we're not looking at someone just developing because their dad was a criminal and so therefore they have the gene, but if they grow up in that environment where someone has been a criminal or commits criminal acts in front of them, now you've got both of these combined together to engage in the antisocial behavior. Just want to say that again. If you look down here at this explains it very well, that if someone does, if their parents are criminals or have participated in criminal activity, that it increases the proclivity for risky behavior or criminal behavior. And because of that, they might choose to frequent places that tolerate that antisocial behavior. And that allows them to engage in the antisocial behavior. Remember, this is under the correlated biosocial model. Doesn't mean you agree with this. This is what this model is saying occurs. And as I was saying on the correlated biosocial model, we have the passive gene environment correlation that I just discussed, and we have the active gene environment correlation that occurs when individuals select themselves into certain environments based upon their genetically influenced traits. Individuals, their genetic makeup, therefore influences their personality, and their personality influences their choices, so they choose to spend time in those environments that include antisocial behavior. This also includes the evocative gene environment correlation. This occurs when individuals' genetically influenced personality traits may evoke certain responses from their environment. As I said, I'm just going through these. I'm not asking you to memorize any of this information. Just understand that these are different elements of the correlated biosocial model. Now we're going to move and talk about the sequential biosocial model. Before I go into the other two models, I just want to make sure that I have clarified that these are four models under the biosocial paradigm, the biosocial thought under positivism. Biosocial, as I said, is nurture and nature. That it's a combination of your biology, your genetics, your biological makeup, the person you're born as, along with what you're exposed to in your environment. So it's leading to both of those causes of criminal behavior. So these four models are here to provide a theoretical guideline so that we can conduct biosocial criminological research using these models. Just remember, they're very general and they do not specify which biological components are most relevant to the study of criminal or deviant behavior. Okay, did you understand that? I will actually here we are, go over this a little bit more in class, but just to understand, like I said, these are very general models. I don't want you to get wrapped up around these because they can be quite confusing. So the third biosocial model is called the sequential biosocial model, where the individual's environments may influence their biological functioning. The epigenetic effect occurs when exposure to certain environments cause genes to either shut off or turn on, and research has determined that the environment can influence the expression of 900 plus genes. In a nutshell, when we are looking at sequential bisocial model, an easier way maybe for me to explain it than this goobly-gook from your book is think of a child that may be born completely, I don't really like this word, but normal. Let's say no biological issues, has a very healthy birth from a very healthy mother who does not do drugs and does everything she's supposed to do as a mother. But let's just say this baby is born and is exposed to child abuse, could be exposed to drugs within the home, could be exposed to lead within the house, could be exposed to not able to eat, starvation, which then impacts their body, right? Impacts them biologically. Say their mother breastfeeds and smokes marijuana or drinks alcohol. So now the baby is exposed to the environment, and therefore this influences their biology, their human body. And so that is what sequential biosocial model is. Now, the last biosocial model, I'm going to explain this as simply as I can. This is just a combination of both the biological and sociological risk. So someone might be born a criminal, they have the gene, they might be born with some damage to their prefrontal cortex, they might have a brain abnormality, but they're born with some type of gene. This combines with the sociological environment. So they are born into an environment that is starvation. They're born into an environment that is ridden with criminal activity. And that increases their risk factors more than any other. So they've got both working together that increases their effects. So it makes each worse. How's that? It makes your biological worse and your environment worse at the same time. So it's not like the addictive that just adds the two together to make criminal activity. What this model is saying is that each one, because they each have the element, it enhances it and makes it even worse. Like if you drink alcohol, it does something. If you take a pill, it does something. And then when you drink alcohol and the pill, it makes it even worse. That's what this means. And when you read about the genes, the gene X environmental interaction and the gene X gene, these are just genes that have been identified that affect other genes in a certain way. And next we're going to talk just a tiny bit about genetics, and I apologize, I didn't want this recording to turn into 25 minutes, but your book is going to talk about the genetics, and this is, as we said, under your biological indicators, but it's broken down into two different types of genetics, which is your behavioral genetics and your molecular genetics. The behavioral genetics is focused on certain phenotypes such as aggression, violence, and criminality, talks about the heritability coefficient, shared versus non-shared environmental influences. Your molecular genetics is more specific generic variants that are associated or show an increased level of antisocial and criminal behavior. When studying the behavioral genetics, researchers looked into the twin studies. They did twin studies and adoption studies to try to show what really led to the antisocial behavior. The twin studies, and I think in your book it talks a little bit about it, but they really were not conclusive. And it's the same thing with the adoption studies. The adoption studies that did show that children who were born from criminal parents did have a higher propensity for criminal behavior. and a very interesting story on this, and I hope I can remember to tell you more about it. And the book that I'm going to bring in, there's a really good story about a young man who committed murder, multiple murder, and had criminal behavior throughout his life. He was adopted at a young age, and he participated in criminal behavior from a young boy all the way up until adulthood, escalating throughout his life, and then end up committing murder. Ends up in prison. I'm not sure if it was death row or not, but he ended up in prison, and he was talking to a gentleman there, and he had the same last name as, he knew who his adoptive father was, and I guess he had changed his name or something. I'll check and get the specifics to it. But anyway, he's told by another inmate in there that there's a guy here with your same name, and it turns out that it was his biological father, and he was in there for murder, and they had never met each other. So just a little interesting tidbit. And according to the researchers that support positivism and biosocial, that criminal behavior is linked to brain structure and function, which therefore leads us to the neurotransmitters, are the brain's chemical messengers, and they believe that criminal behavior is most linked to this monoamine neurotransmitter, such as dopamine, serotonin, and monoamine oxidase. In other words, that whether there's a larger amount of this or a reduced amount, that these can lead to criminal behavior. One of the last sections of the biosocial model, which really I think has a lot of potential, and I really believe that this is one of those areas that can help us explain criminal behavior, and that environments impact biology. And I've talked about this a few minutes ago, but this research focused mostly on prenatal and perinatal environments and how they affected the biological functioning. It's just like I said, that there's a critical period where a child has to be nurtured and feel that attachment to a caregiver. So a child that, even though they're perfectly healthy and normal upon birth, if they are put into an antisocial an antisocial environment, such as even if they're given up for adoption and turned straight into a home where they're not bonded with someone, they're not nurtured immediately. There's that critical period of the first 33 months of life, and this has been shown to increase. When I studied this about 12 years ago on attachment theory, that with Bowlby, that the critical period then was really seen as 6 months, that if you could just get through those 6 months. But now we can see that it's really longer than that, and the effects of an environment on brain structure and functioning are dramatic in both positive and negative ways. I want you to understand through all of this information that these ideals and ideologies increase the risk of criminal behavior, but no one thing can be shown to cause crime. Deficient social processes can increase the risk of deviant criminal behavior. Understand that crime is generated by forces that are largely beyond the realm of individual choice when we're talking about biology. Brain abnormalities is another area. They could be caused by a number of elements, a number of impacts, such as concussion, such as any brain development prior to birth, after birth, that then can predispose that person to antisocial behavior. That, combined with the environment, parental attachment, peer involvement, drugs, alcohol abuse, those can all increase the predisposition to violence. They could increase it up to 80% to an increased risk of violence. So the next recording that we're going to talk about will be just strictly on the chapter on violence. But I want you to remember all the stuff that we just went over when we talk about the violence and how these models impact the risk of violence.